And I'm very quick to say to everyone that there are few signs that you can see that makes you realize that this is the right time to begin to advocate. This is the right time to begin to speak about an issue. And I have about six of them. The first is when there are policy gaps. When you talk about policy, one of the quick things that comes to mind, it is how people or how governments or how systems are able to run, how people who have gotten into political power or any leadership position at any point are able to lead. So a government comes into power and they say that we want zero out of school children. That is a policy statement. Some people would come out, and I remember the president in 2022, came out to say if he is not able to solve the power problem in Nigeria, no one should vote for him in um, in 2027, right? And what he said was a policy statement, you know, um, the implementation of that policy is now dependent on, people like you and I who are the ones that these policies are directed to. And so someone who is very smart would quickly ask me, Busaya, what's the difference between a policy, and a law? Now, a policy is just a pronouncement, it's a blueprint. It's probably what, a leader says, this is what we are going to do. Now, it's important that we note that policies in themselves, though beautiful, though amazing, are not justiciable. And by not justiciable, what I mean is you cannot take the president to come in. The president is, has immunity, right? But even when he stops being the president, you can't take him to court um, because he said he was going to provide power, you know, and he didn't. Right. And the reason is because a policy is not justiciable. You cannot go to court and you say, my Lord, this person has said he was going to do XYZ, and he didn't do it. Now, but when you go to court, for example, on a law, then it becomes justiciable because there has been an act of parliament that is backing it. And by the act of parliament, what I mean is either the State House of Assembly or the House of Representative or the Senate, right? So, for example, if you look at the budget of Nigeria and look at the amount of fraud that goes into the budget of Nigeria, it is something that one of you, anyone, could be able to take to court, right? Because it's a law, and the justice system sits on laws. The justice system does not sit on policies. I just wanted to make that clear so that when we get into policy influencing, you're not expecting so much, from these conversations. It's very important. So the first point where there's someone playing with my slides, please be gentle with them. The first point is, you know, the Afiz, you're playing with my slide. Please just leave the slides. Don't tamper with them. Thank you so much. Um, the first point, when advocacy becomes necessary is when you see that there are policy gaps, when systemic implementation fails on the ground, right? For example, right, the fuel subsidy is gone or is overstatement from the president was a policy conversation. You know, Unfortunately, you cannot take the presidency to court, to say he must pay subsidy because there's nowhere in the Constitution of the Federal Republic that says subsidy must be paid. So it's clearly not justiciable. But a good point of advocacy is when the systemic, when there are policy gaps, when there's a gap in the implementation, and everywhere across Nigeria, we understand that there's been that gap, in terms of implementation of various policies be it from education to health, to power to electricity. So it's a good point to advocate. So when you see people from maybe the Take It Back movement, whatever movement, when you see them go on the streets to protest, when you see them on TV, when you see them, and I think everybody, every one single individual, should be able to speak, when there's a policy implementation gap. Right. I mean, the second point where you can advocate is when there's a blockage in your program, in the program. So, for example, when local initiatives face bureaucratic gridlock, one of these examples I see, particularly around local governments in Nigeria, is the fact that most Nigerians do not realize, for example, that basic education should not be the responsibility of the federal government, but the sole responsibility of the state and the local government, right? Someone is going to say, but there's something called universal basic education. Actually, it was supposed to be an intervention program that was supposed to last only 10 years, but unfortunately, it's lasted, and unfortunately it's backed up by the acts of parliament. And so the federal government has to put in a 50% for the state government to put in another 50%, which is rubbish, by the way, because you have the local government education authority, you have the state universal education board, SUBEB, so typically, a good point, for us to advocate is when, local initiatives face bureaucratic gridlock, when you have an issue with your councillor, when you have an issue with your local government chairman, the program is just not working. It's a good time to advocate. It's a good time to speak about the issues that you're concerned with. Another good time to take action in terms of advocacy, and by take action in terms of advocacy, what I mean is another good time to advocate, is when you understand the root cause of a problem. Most times, what we talk about are, are the symptoms of the problems and not really, the problem. I just spoke about education now, all right? Now, if you see the amount of out of school children in Nigeria, and you're quick to talk about that out of school children in Nigeria pandemic, like we like to call it, you're just telling half of the story. I mean, not even half of the story. The real story is in the fact that people saddled with the responsibility of power at the basic level, I'm talking about local governments and the state government, are not responsible enough to ensure that they prioritize the education of children. Now, that's the root cause of the problem. Now, one of the most difficult places to invest in, if you're a politician, is in education. The reason is because for and you see it everywhere across Nigeria currently. And I'm going to be using real examples so that you can be able to connect and understand me quite better, so that I'm not speaking over your heads. The president was speaking recently, and he said, and by the way, just so you know, if you're on this call, and you think I'm referencing the president too much, I'm not a fan of the president. I'll just give you real life examples so that you can run away with and deduce whatever you think you want to deduce from the conversation. But I'm going to say, the president had said that governors should spend more of their resources doing more, you know, development focused work instead of building bridges, right? And I laughed and I said that a governor who wants to contest in the next election would not see education as a viable place to invest in. And I give you the reason why, and it's not rocket science, it's just common sense. I give you the reason why. For you to be able to reap the dividends of investment in education, it takes approximately 18 to 25 years for you to see the investment you make, even if it's in basic education. And by basic education within the, within the Nigerian space, you're talking about primary education and GSS1 to GSS3. I don't know if the law has been changed yet. We had a massive advocacy to extend it to senior secondary 3. Now, imagine if you're a politician and you're running for office and you have, you want to run again for a second term, and you can see that, you need to do projects, quote and unquote, that people would see, people can relate with, people can engage with. You would, well, if you are put with the choice of building a flyover and investing in education, education does not look like something that can be seen because it's intangible. So, if a governor, for example, invests 30% of his budget in education, many of us will not vote for that governor again because we would say the governor is not constructing roads. We cannot see what he's doing. We cannot see him build flyovers like other people are doing. But you do not realize that the investment in basic education, is what is going to generate in the next 15 to 20 years to 25 years to 30 years is what is going to generate the future, the right kind of future, the right kind of atmosphere, for the state, for the community, right? And so I say to a whole lot of people that most times we just talk about the surface level issues. We do not interrogate the root cause of the issue. So one time where you can begin to advocate, a good time where you can begin to advocate, where your advocacy becomes very necessary, is when you understand the root cause of the issue. Like I said, investing in education, may not be physically tangible. So a whole lot of politicians will go with investment in road infrastructure, and they build overhead bridges that leads nowhere. And so I'm saying to you that if for any reason you find yourself, in a political position, in a place where you can make decision, you must be able to understand and ratio what kinds of decisions you're going to make. Do you want to just be popular, or you want to invest in the future, of your people? Very, very important. Another time where your action is necessary is when vulnerable populations, face distinct and actionable problems, right? So it must, if this just simply means that it must not concern you directly. It must not concern you directly. It must not concern your father or your mother directly. So many years ago, and I'm talking about between 2010, 2010 to 2012, right? When the Boko Haram insurgencies were not as massive as it became, a whole lot of the people in the Southwest were really not concerned. They didn't care. At the time, Nigeria had over 2.5 million internal displaced persons. A whole lot of people in the Southwest, in the South, didn't really care. People in the North Central also didn't care. They thought it was just a Northeast phenomenon. They thought it was just a Borno, a Yola, an Adamawa, or, a Yobe thing. Not until the bombs started coming closer home, not until, Abuja was hit. Even when Abuja was hit in the North Central, I mean, a whole lot of people who still didn't care. But today, we can see the offshoot of Boko Haram insurgencies, becoming a thing. And we can see what kidnapping and banditry has become. And it came so close to Lagos. It came so close to Lagos in Ibadan. Now, one of the things that happens when we do not speak for disadvantaged communities is the fact that the same things we do not speak frantically about may just begin to come closer to us, and it happens, to us, or it happens to members of our family. And so for me, as a life as a life goal, one of the things I say to myself is, at every point, I would advocate, I would speak on behalf, I would speak for, disadvantaged communities that do not have a voice, right? I tell you the truth, if what has happened in the northeast has happened in the southwest, it would have stopped, it wouldn't spread. And the reason why is because there is what you call the proximity to media, and the southwest Nigeria, has that proximity to the media. They're able to use the instrumentality of the media, but because we ignored and said it was a northern issue, it was a northeast issue, we're now having the spillovers, till now. This is just an extreme example, but there are a whole lot of times that things happen to communities around us that we feel it wouldn't happen to me. It can never happen to me. So, for example, when we talk about bad roads, it's easy for those of you who live in Abuja, not to care, not until the day you probably have to get on the road yourself, and you experience what is happening on the road and you understand why you need to, add your voice to the conversations that are already happening. Another good point of an advocacy or for you to start an advocacy is when there's a missing link, when there's a disconnect, especially when local, national, regional, or international concerns disconnect. So, for example, and I say this about Nigeria a whole lot. The world is talking about advancement in technology. Everyone is talking about AI. In fact, some people have said that Earth is too small for them. They want to go live in space. They want to go to Mars. They want to go to the moon. There are a whole lot of conversations going out, everywhere globally. And when you come into Nigeria and you zoom into the conversations that are happening, in the Senate, sometimes it feels very terrible. It feels very disappointing. It feels very sad when everything you hear about is someone is padding the budget, someone is calling someone this name, someone is, singing on your mandate in the National Assembly, someone is doing so. And you ask yourself, are we really a part of the global world, especially in the era of globalization? Right? Someone will say to me that Nigeria, still has so much problems, so Nigeria cannot be able to, join the world in the movement and where everyone is going to. But I would tell you that this is a good point, for you to start an advocacy, and someone should just wake up and begin to ask questions. What are the 106 people doing in the Senate? What are they actually doing there? What are they talking about? You pay them, for God's sakes. I mean, this is just an example. It could be something as little as the disconnect between what is happening in your area, as against, global best practices. The world has become a global village. You don't have to spend so much time for you to know what is happening in America or to know what is happening in South Africa. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time for you to know what's happening at the other side of the world. You can see everything that is happening. And I think it's also good for you to spur people to begin to advocate to say that as a people, we cannot just continue to play second fiddle. I give you this example. When COVID-19 started, it was disappointing, to see African countries literally beg for vaccines. And I was asking myself, with all the professors we have in Nigeria, with all the whole, biochemistry students that graduate every year, from institutions across Nigeria, we were practically begging for the vaccines. Right, shout out to a few institutions. I think Covenant University, and I think it was the Redeemers University, that had this state of art research, laboratory for COVID. Shout out to those guys. But when you see, I sat on a panel on a Gavi panel, in 2020, in 2021. And one of the things I said was I felt embarrassed as an African, to see how African presidents were begging, for vaccines, and he who pays the piper, they say, dictates the tune. And so I'm not surprised when, for example, Africa is treated like a second fiddle, because we've not been able to establish that link. What is the world talking about? What are we talking about? We've not been able to look at ourselves in the mirror. So I'm saying that when you discover missing links, it's a good time for you to be advocating for whatever you believe in. And it could be anything. It must not be around the examples I've spoken about. Everyone on this call have various interests. Everyone on this call, have various points where, you see something and you feel genuine pain, about what that thing is. You can begin an advocacy in that space. You can begin to talk about it. You can begin to have conversations, about it. Um, spent so much time on this slide, so I'll move to the next slide. There are three dimensions of, advocacy. And when I talk about advocacy, one of the things that becomes very important is your ability to use your voice, your ability to use your voice to speak on behalf of the people, the ability for you to use your voice to speak on behalf, of yourself. I mean, and an interesting example I always try to give on these classes is the example around the family, right? um so many of so many of us probably grew up with our siblings, and for example, if you're the last born like me, out of six children, I mean, I'm the last born, and within the African context, there's a way that last borns are being treated quite unfairly. How many last borns do we have on this call? Let me see on in the um give me a thumbs up in the chat if you're a last born. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat, but if you're a last born, give me a thumbs up. Okay, I think I can see the chat now. How many last borns do we have on the call? Ah, okay, yeah, great. Joshua, you're my guy. How many last borns do we have? Just give me thumbs up. I see. Oh no, we have so many last bonds. Great. You know how they treat last bonds within the house, and maybe that's where I learned, advocacy from, because I had to learn to speak for myself. Because when they start distributing stuff, they start from the firstborn, and I'm the sixth born. Before it gets to me, it's really small, and it's always painful, right? I'm always the last person to go pick my food. You know, I mean, I can't make some moves because my, elder siblings have not made some moves and all of those stuff. And I said to myself, if I continue this way, these people would kill me, because I would end up suffering, from this reality. And I started speaking for myself, and the more I realized that, the more I spoke for myself, the more I got the things that I needed. I had to summon the courage to speak to my siblings, to speak to my parents, to say, I mean, you need to prioritize me also. I'm part of this family. You people didn't make a mistake giving birth to me. And it's very, very important because in advocacy, there are three dimensions. And these three dimensions, the least dimension for me is when we speak on behalf of people, when we challenge authorities on behalf of other people. So what this simply means is, you know I go into a community and there's no potable water, and probably the children are dying of cholera because they have to go to the stream and get dirty water, and they drink dirty water, and there's a whole lot of, diseases in the community. I get into that community. Remember that as an advocate, it shouldn't affect me directly. So I go into the community, I'm passionate, very passionate. So I begin to speak on behalf of the community. That's the according to my ranking, you would see that the least level is when you are the one who is speaking, for the community. I mean, it's good. It's a start. It's a start. But if your advocacy ends at the point where it's just you speaking on behalf of the community, there's something missing. And that thing that is missing is the reason why we created the second step, in terms of the dimensions of an advocacy. And this second step is when I now begin to partner with the community. Now, what this means is I come into the community probably does not even have power, they don't have internet, so they don't even know how to shout, they don't know how to make a tweet, they don't know how to do anything. So I get into the community and I'm the one speaking for them because I can tweet, I have internet, I have the resources, in terms of digital resources and maybe financial resources, economic resources. I can be able to speak on their behalf. Now, what happens between the point where I am speaking for them and where they begin to speak with me, which is the middle point, is the hard work I have to put in as an advocate to build their capacities to be able to begin to say the same things that I am saying with even more intensity than what I'm saying, because they are the ones who have the lived experience. So what it means is I'm probably come out of my house, probably my street is very tarred, I have a car, I can fuel, I can drive to the community. But I'm not just speaking because And this is where, most times advocates, the current, you know, people we call advocates, this is the challenge that happens, with them. Now, advocacy, because you're speaking and you're speaking loudly and the world is listening to you, you can begin to think that it's about you. And sometimes these things happen subtly. It's not, most times people who fall into this category did not necessarily start up like this. But this is what happens. And I would explain it to you quite openly. When I started my work, in the civil society space, as an advocate, I didn't want to go on TV. I didn't want to go on air. I didn't want to join any, I just wanted to do my, clean work behind, so that people would see the work that I was doing. But it got to a point where I started going on radio and I could recognize Itodo on this call because Itodo was an OAP, at an FM there. I've probably gone to his radio station, because I also had a friend, Kike, who was an OAP at the radio station. I was on Wazobia every week. I was on Channels TV, I was on Arise TV, I was on AIT, I was on NT, I was on everywhere, speaking, advocating on various issues that were quite particular to us, and I realized over time that if care was not taken, I would begin to feel like I am bigger than what I was because, see, when people begin to listen to you, you must be very careful to understand that it's not about you, but it's about the community. And what now happens, what people begin to do is that they begin to call you a resource person or an analyst. They give you one fancy name, and you just discover that when there's an issue, all the media houses will rush, send you a WhatsApp message, send you an email, we want you on our station. And the more you speak on air, you become more popular. And every human wants to be celebrated. Everybody wants to be able to be in front of the TV, and you just get carried away. And so in 2020, after COVID lockdown, I decided not to go on air, and I didn't go on air for almost a year, after that. Because for me, I realized that I was beginning to take the place of the community. So I went back and continued to invest in the abilities for communities to speak for themselves. Because those communities are the ones who have lived experience. I have never experienced drinking water from the stream. I do not know what it means. I have not, the fact that I'm passionate about talking about it does not mean that I have the lived experience. And so most times the people we call advocates stop at the first level. And those of you on this call, it's important for you not to stop at this level. It's important for you to do the hard work of building the capacity of the communities to begin to speak for themselves. Now, it's going to be a long step. So we have to take it step by step. The first step, you're correct, you're doing it, you're speaking on behalf of them, but let it not end there. Go to the second step where partnership has happened. One or two people in the community should be able to go with you to the radio station. One or two people from the community should be able to go with you to the TV station. What you're doing is you're granting them the exposure. You're showing them what to do. You're teaching them how to make a tweet. You're teaching them how to make a Facebook post. You're teaching them how to record a video, make sure the video is clear, and to show the world how terrible their water is. You're teaching them all of these things because if I want to do something about it, I will take those people more serious than you, who is just passionate about it. You may have not had the lived experience. Now, I'm not saying that this is what happens in all cases. There are times when you also are part of, you have lived experience. For example, the inflation in Nigeria, everybody has lived the experience of the inflation in Nigeria. So I'm talking about particular issues that doesn't concern you directly. So the next step is when partnership now happens. When that partnership begins to happen, you would realize that your work is even getting easier. You would realize also that the community is able to, people in the community are able to now begin to have the courage to speak for themselves. You would see it happen. And it feels very beautiful because I've done this over time. And I see the beauty when I get into a community and they cannot even articulate what the problem is. And in few months' time, they're able to speak about the problem. They're able to speak to their leaders about the problem. Because when I go to, I mean, I went to a community called Anka in it's called Bagega and Anka local government in Zamfara, for example, and I mean that was sometime in 2019. Before then, the first time my colleagues went to that community, there was no network, there was no internet, nothing. But we did the work that we had to do. Internet, network came, school came, they made their roads, and I mean, by the way, that was what started Follow the Money movement. And we went back to the community in 2019, and we could see young people articulate what the problem was, the lead poisoning issue, the amount of children that were at the risk of dying, and we heard them speak for themselves. There's nothing as beautiful as that. Now, for me, the highest level of an advocacy is when those same people are beginning to speak for themselves. At that point, they don't even need me to speak for them. They know what to say. They know how to go about it. They know how to engage with the government. They know how to engage, people who are running for election. Now, what has happened from the first time where I was speaking for them is that I grew their capacity enough for them to speak. We were able to speak, about the issue together. But I didn't just stop at that level. I took it to the highest level where they are able to speak for themselves. So if I do not go there tomorrow, there's someone there who would speak for them. If I'm too busy, if I'm tired, if I say I'm not doing this again, because it's actually not my problem. There are people in the community who now have the ability, to engage. So, I mean, if this was a church, I was going to say, turn to your neighbor and say, don't stop at the first level, go to the second level, and the third level. Yeah, so let's look at the core difference between advocacy and policy influencing, because this becomes very important. I spoke a whole lot about advocacy, and I'll summarize and I'll get into policy influencing. Right. The first dimension in speaking about advocacy is simple. Advocacy is basically speaking up, causing a public debate, and challenging those in authority, right? While policy influencing, on the other hand, is a bit more scientific. It is the deliberate and systemic process of influencing practices and behaviors. It's systemic. I always like to say that policy influencing and advocacy they're not arts in themselves. It's a science, and it's very, very deliberate, right? Especially when it comes to policy influencing, because what you're trying to influence, is the core of what, governance is probably resting on. And so anybody can be an advocate. Anybody can advocate about anything, but not everybody, can be a policy influencer. And it's very important that we understand these two things. And it's not a thing of pride, right? I can beat my chest and say that within my work in Nigeria, while I was working actively in Nigeria, I'd influenced a whole lot of governments, to change their policy or to create new policies. In fact, we didn't stop at them just creating these policies. We had to go through parliament to back it up by law. And so we didn't stop at policy influencing. We went straight for the highest reward ever, for any advocate, which is ensuring that that policy becomes law and it's backed by the act of parliament. So it's a skill. It's something that you can learn. It's something that you should be able to learn. And so after this session today, you should invest a bit more time, looking at, everything I'm sharing or I've shared. I'm probably going to share this slide because this is not my original slide. I'll share this slide so that everyone is able to go back, and listen to it, and or probably, watch this. I know this is streaming on YouTube, so you can go back and watch, or you can get the slides, and go over it again, right? It's very, very, very important. The second layer is advocacy, means people in position of power who, advocating, is holding people in position of power who hold negative attitudes towards disadvantaged people. I've spoken about this. Advocacy is also finding solutions to bad situations, changing negative behaviors to ensure fair treatment. Now, the last definition of advocacy is one something I really like, because some of us will think that advocates just talk. No, advocates also provide solutions, right? So if every time I come out and I tell you the educational system is bad, and I do not probably present any solution, right? Then I've not done my work, right? So it takes me straight up into policy influencing, right? Policy influencing, again, I say, is a deliberate and systematic process of influencing practices and behaviors. That thing that your governor is doing that doesn't make sense, you know, your ability to be able to be deliberate and drive systemic influencing, around those practices, right? Under policy influencing, there are different targeted stakeholders, that are most influential on a specific issue, right? So sometimes one of the biggest challenges is you want to be able to influence government policies, but you do not know who to speak to. You probably do not have access to the governor. You probably do not have access to the local government chairman. And so one of the most difficult place anybody would be is asking, how do I reach out to this person? Right? And maybe you can't even reach out on social media, because if you send a DM, sometimes they think you're begging for money, or they may not even respond, right? So I'm going to take us through how to be able to, engage targeted stakeholders. Policy influencing is also involving beneficiaries directly to increase their ownership and long-term capacity on the issue. I just spoke about that. That your advocacy must not stop at the level where you're the only one speaking to, about the problem. The community should be able to begin to learn how to speak about the problem, and at the highest level, without you, the community, is able to speak about the problem, right? Um, it's very, very important, for us to understand, one of the pillars of policy influencing, and we use the acronym, CLASP, CLASP, and C stands for credibility. Why would people trust you as an advocate, as someone who wants to influence government policies? Why should we trust you that you're going to be able to speak on our behalf? Why should we trust you? What makes you credible? We have a whole lot of people today that, those of you on this call will probably look at them and you call them protestpreneurs, which sounds like an insult, but there's a reason why people are called that, because you've lost trust. Nobody trusts you. I remember during the subsidy removal protest in 2012, everybody was on the streets, and the NLC, got on a plane and went to visit Goodluck Jonathan in Abuja from Lagos. And they came back, and the next thing we heard that the protest, has been cancelled. The protest was over. What happened after that was the fact that someone lost their life in Ojota because the army shot at someone directly. A group of people, or some people, directly or indirectly, during the NSAS protests, looked at the protesters and called it an insurrection. And when that happened, nobody trusts them again. One of the reasons why the NLC is where it is today is because really it doesn't have credibility. There was a time when the NLC coughs, the government feels the impact. But now the NLC can cough from today to tomorrow and nothing will happen. What changed? People lost credibility. And the moment you lose credibility, nobody is going to be able to respond to you. So as we begin to try or intend to be advocates, ask yourself, am I trustworthy enough? Can people trust me that their interests will be protected? Can people trust me that when I meet with government agencies, I'm not going to collect transport fare? Because the moment you begin to collect transport fare, they're casting gray skies. And unfortunately, you may not know that there's a camera in the room where you collected transport fare. And when you begin to talk so much, the government, shows you the video of you collecting money. And that's all. That's what happens. We've seen people that have been blackmailed. On my work in the not-for-profit sector, for example, in Nigeria, I never, and I've been to almost all the states in the country, worked in almost all the states in the country. I had people in 774 local governments in the country, and not for once did I ever take even transport fare. I think the highest I did was out of courtesy was to take bottled water. When I go into meetings, I take my own water because I understand that my credibility in discussing the issue is important, but much more, my credibility with the people I'm speaking for is very, very important. And so it's very, very important. C stands for credibility, L stands for legitimacy. Who or what gives you the right to interfere, right? I remember one time I was on advocacy to a local government in Kogi State, and I was talking to the caretaker chairman, and one of the directors sat, and he didn't know that my colleague, because like I said, I have colleagues everywhere in the country. My colleagues spoke the same language they were speaking, Ebira, and I was speaking to the local government chairman. Every time I try to say something, the director, speaks into his ears, but we could hear. I mean, I mean, I'm Yoruba. I don't understand the language, and my colleague just brought out his phone and sent me a message that this is what this director is saying, and what he was asking was, who are these people? What gave them the rights to come, to our state? They are coming from Abuja. Who are there? And when I saw that, I had to pause the meeting and I introduced myself and I told them that I'm a citizen of the Federal Republic of Nigeria and the work that I do, is very, very important to be able to hold governments like them to account to ensure that, because it was an education campaign I was running, a basic education gets to the children, right? So you must be able to understand your legitimacy, what makes you legitimate. It's very, very important because people will ask that question. What are you doing in my state? Who gave you the rights to come here? And it's the same thing, the police tries to do when they try to harass people. The A in CLASP is accountability. Are you practicing total transparency? Transparency becomes very important because the truth of the matter is you're working on a slippery slope. You are engaging with people who have power. You are also engaging with people who do not have power. And the way you handle these engagements, would reflect on how the people who do not have power listen or understand or treat you, and it's also going to be reflective on how the people who have power understands and treats you. So you must be able to be plain. And that's why I always say that if your advocacy is still just about what you're saying, you are at the lowest level. The moment your advocacy becomes collaborative with the people you're speaking on behalf of, accountability is easy. For most of the meetings that I went to or attended with government people, one of the things I ensured to do was to carry community along. And it was deliberate because I needed the community to understand how to engage, but much more than how to engage, I needed to show them the tricks and turns of the politicians, of the people in government, to say they will try to give you transport, ensure that you do not collect it. They will try to do this, ensure that this is your response. You saw how I responded to them. When they said transport is a must, you saw how I responded to them politely, not in a way that will embarrass them. It was simple for me to say, as a matter of policy, I can't take it. And I ensure that I make community aware that the moment you begin to take this transport fare, it's a problem, it's an indictment, because the day that there's problem, they will tell you, but you collected the transport fare, that we've been giving to you. So accountability is very, very important. The S is service. How you been helpful? Are you seeking a win-win scenario? One of the challenges when you're traveling alone in the advocacy journey is that you do not even know when you are a stumbling block, in the progress of the issue. Right. So are you seeking a win-win? Are you realistic with the people you're supporting or the people you're trying to engage with? Are you very realistic? For example, there's no way under God's heaven, that that petrol price will go back to, 165 it was at the time, which is quite unfortunate, by the way, you know. But I mean, an average question I want to ask is, what is the win-win solution? What is the win-win situation? Is 1-5 the win-win? Is 1-2 the win-win? Is 1,000 the win? It's ridiculous. I'm thinking about it again. It's very ridiculous. But you must be able to, understand when the wins are the wins. You must be able to understand and ratio that. I know that sometimes, because of the distrust we have with government, we may not want to, have any win-win scenario with them. But the truth of the matter is, if it's about service, you must be able to recognize when a win-win is happening. Now, the P is which is one of the most important principles of policy influencing, is power. What is your power base and how do you use it? One of the greatest powers in a democracy is your power as a citizen of wherever country you come from. That's your greatest power. And so you would hear things like the highest office in the land. It's not the office of the president, it's not the office of the governor, it's the office of the citizen. Now, if the citizens understand their power, you would understand that it falls within your rights to elect who you want to elect and do not elect who you do not want to elect. You would realize that rigging will become a thing of the past if citizens actually understand their power. So it's always interesting when people talk and say there's nothing we can do, blah 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 blah, rubbish. There is everything you can do. You do not have to wait for the next election cycle to not vote someone. There's a process backed up by the Constitution, which is an impeachment process. There's a process called the recall process. Do I know that these laws are flawed? Yes. The laws are flawed because the people who we send to represent us in parliament are actually not from us. I cannot send you to represent me and you not do my bidding. If I'm sending you to represent me in parliament, and I say what I want you to do in parliament is only two things: ensure that impeaching the president is easier, backed by the constitution; ensure that the recall process is easier, backed by the constitution. It's simple. If you cannot do that, get out of there. Until citizens begin to organize, and that's why one of the reasons why there's electoral college, by the way, and I think it's very amazing, what Kunle Lawal and the team is doing, right? Until we get to that point where citizens understand their power. For example, in the UK, the Prime Minister actually didn't do anything wrong. I mean, I'm currently speaking to you from the UK and I follow the politics of the UK, and I can tell you for free, Keir Starmer didn't do anything wrong, really. He didn't steal anybody's money. What, quote and unquote, he did that was wrong. He nominated someone to be an ambassador, and the person was in the Epstein's files, you know. And I mean, his party lost an election, his party ratings came down. And the party said, Starmer, we're done with you. You have to stop being the prime minister. That was all. That was all. As a Nigerian, I couldn't relate. I'm like, Nigerians will tell you, wait till the next election. Until we understand that in a democracy, it's actually the people who have the power who would continue to play around, would continue to murmur and tweet about it and, argue about it, and nothing is really going to change. But we want to see a change, and that's why we're saying that you must understand in policy influencing that you must understand, what your power base is and how you use it. If you want to influence policies effectively, you must understand that you cannot do it alone. You have to have a team. It must be joined, a collective effort. It also requires expertise. It actually requires an unwavering belief in your message. And that's why I say anybody can be an advocate. But if you want to influence policies, it's more scientific, it's more organized. You cannot just do things anyhow. You cannot just talk anyhow. You must understand your power and understand, how to use it. Now, speaking about power, because I said, guys, that one of the things in policy influencing that is very, very important is power. You know, I have this slide on navigating the corridors of power. And I start with who your primary target is. And I explain what all of these targets are, so that everybody is able to understand and we're able to be on the same. In understanding power and how to engage with power when you want to influence policies, it's important that you know who the primary targets of your advocacy or policy influencing drive is targeted to. Your primary target is typically the person, the individual with the ultimate power and authority in the decision-making chain who, can give you the outcome that you want, right? Now, let me use an example of a state for you. We have issues with education. Who is ultimately responsible, for educational policies in a state? Someone will say to me, the commissioner of education. Another person will say to me, the executive secretaries of education in the local government. Another person will say to me, the governor. You're very correct. The primary target is anyone who has the responsibility or who has the authority to drive the kind of change that we want. So when I look at education from the local government standpoint, the local government education secretary has a certain level of power and at a particular time could be the primary target. The local government chairman, has a certain level of authority, and at a certain time, he can be a primary target. And so your primary target may shift depending on the issue or how broad the issue is or how intense the issue is. But anybody who is within that position to make a decision that would influence what you're talking about, becomes your primary target. It's very, very important that I state this. Now, your secondary targets are typically individuals who are not the ultimate decision makers, but hold significant influence over the chain of decision making. And I'll explain this to you. Those of you who have engaged um, with high network, I'm talking about politicians. Let's leave high network. I'm talking about politicians. You've probably engaged with the commissioner, you've probably engaged with the minister, or you've probably engaged with a local government chairman or even a governor. The governor has powers, but there are other people who can influence the decision of the governor. I was on an policy advocacy sometime in Taraba State. I think this was early 2020 before the lockdown happened. In fact, when the lockdown happened, I was still part of that. I was in transit. And we needed a water bill to be passed. And we went to the parliament to say, we need this bill to be passed. And the chairman in charge of the water committee said to us, he said, if you want this bill to be passed, you need to go and speak to the chief of staff of the governor. And I asked him, why do you need me to speak to the chief of staff of the governor? He said the chief of staff to the governor is actually the former speaker. He didn't tell me to speak with the current speaker. He told me to speak with the chief of staff of the governor, so that the chief of staff is able to speak to the governor to emphasize that this is an urgent bill that needs to be passed. So the bill needs to come from the governor to parliament so that parliament would pass the bill and the governor would assent to the bill, because we needed to ensure that, water was provided to a large demography of people who have not had water. That singular information expedited our work totally. Now, we were not thinking of meeting the governor. We wanted to meet the Speaker of the House of Assembly and say, August Speaker, we need you to pass this bill. But the chairman House Committee, gave us another link that we didn't know existed. And we had a conversation with the chief of staff and we told him, this is what your state is going to benefit if they pass this bill. This is what is going to happen if they pass this bill. We just spoke with the chairman, House Committee on Water, and he says we should speak to you. And the chief of staff took us straight up to the governor. And we're able to expedites the process, and within record time, Taraba State had a new water law. You can Google it. Taraba State got a new water law, and they got a massive investment from the USAID. So sometimes your secondary target could be the wife of the person you want to engage. It could be the driver. So all those of you that look down on security guys and drivers, your advocacy may fail because you're not critical. You're not strategic. The strategic rule is successful campaigns require familiarizing yourself with the rules and processes of the system. Understand power and understand how to use it. Understand how to bargain, understand how to negotiate. It's very important. If you want to be an advocate, you need to learn. If you want to be a policy influencer, you need to do extra. That's very, very important. You need to do extra, right? You must be able to understand how power works and how you can be able to use it, in the favor of your campaign or your advocacy. It's very, very important, right? Now let's classify the players because we're still talking about power. Because I mean, power is something we cannot overemphasize, right? So let's classify the players. When you get into any activity of advocacy or policy influencing, there are 5 people you're looking at. And these 5 people are characterized into your definite supporters. That is the people who align, who believe in what you're saying. Your potential supporter, people who are quite skeptical. They're like 70% in, yeah, this sounds good to my ears, but I've not gotten the clarity yet. There are those people who are the fence sitters. They sit on the fence. They are either here nor there. Very difficult people, you know. Then you have your likely opponent. Uh, this may have some benefit, but I'm not sure we're going to do this now. The likely opponent, quite resistant to your demands due to competing interest. If I speak to the governor may not want me to see him again. If I do this, this would happen. Then obviously you have your definite opponent. These ones, from the moment they saw you, they didn't even like you. Your job as a policy influencer is to be able to understand these 5 categories of people. And so it's very important. And this is where it becomes really scientific. You need to rank the people you're engaging. So for example, let's use education. I want to get into, the state government and talk about education, out of school children. I will have to first of all sit down and say, who are my stakeholders? The teachers, the school principals, the education secretaries in the local government chairman, the house member from my constituency or the house member for education in the State House of Assembly, the commissioner of education, the governor, the governor's wife, very powerful governor's wife, very powerful people, very, very powerful people. I've had all of these people. The next question I ask is, who are my definite supporters? I'd quickly go check everywhere. Has the governor made any speech? Has any of them made any speech around education that connects with what I'm talking about? I'm giving you how this thing happens real time. Who has spoken about or who is more favorable to education? Oh, okay. The wife of the governor even has a foundation that talks about education. Ah, no, she's my definite supporter. I would classify her. I'd rank her on my ranking board. Oh, my definite supporter. Who is the person that I know this person likes to look good? Who is this person? Ah, okay. Potential supporter. Who is that person that is either here nor there? I'll rank the person. Who do I think would give me so much problem? Okay, is the commissioner. The commissioner, he doesn't like guys. When guys talk to him, he prefer ladies. Okay, he's a likely opponent. Who is my definite opponent? Okay, let's say the governor is definite opponent because the governor doesn't want to invest in education. He rather builds roads or flyovers than invest in education because education takes a long time before people see the dividends, right? Okay, so I've ranked them. Now, my first ranking, is definitely going to change when I go out and meet all of these people because the ranking that happened, happened within my team or within myself. I was just thinking about it. I now go and meet these people individually and I'll say, Omo, this person I said was my potential supporter is my definite opponent, so I move the person to, that category immediately. I rearrange all of these people based on my experiences with them, you know. Now, the reason why I'm doing all of these things is for me to be able to know how to manage my resources and my energy. I want to stay a little more with my supporters. I want to be able to flip my potential supporter to become a definite supporter. So with my potential supporter, I probably take so much data. This is the amount of out of school children. This is the place where they're out of school. This is the reason why they're out of school. This is the challenge. This is what happens when we do not take them back to school. This is what happens. There's going to be insurgency, kidnapping, banditry. And so we must be able to do that now so that, in the next 5 years, people will give reference to you that you've done. These are all, the twists and turns that I'm doing to flip them to become my definite supporters. So probably you've heard somewhere that the commissioner probably wants to run for office, and you say to him, if you do this, you have to do this because people would even reckon with you more that you are interested in, changing the lives of our children and all of those stuff. Now, all of the reasons why I'm doing these processes is to be able to get them on my side. And that's why policy influencing is strategic. It's not something you just do, it's not something you just talk about. It's advocacy and policy influencing are similar. They're like a twin, but they play different roles. And you must understand how those roles work. The goal is to also change my fence sitter to become my potential or definite supporter. There are some people that will not change. You have to leave them and just walk because the moment you get your end result, they will come back to you to become your definite supporters. Very fickle people. That's why I don't like the people. I prefer to know that you don't like me than for me to not be sure where you are. So using the numbering system to classify your allies, your opponents, your targets becomes extremely, extremely important because it would shape the kind of information, the kind of conversations that you are having with each of them at various points. Right. So let's look at the toolkit. We've talked about the dimensions of advocacy. We've talked about policy influencing, why it's necessary. We've talked about power, understanding power. We've talked about your targets. So let's look at, your tools because your tools are very important. You cannot go to the farm without your farm tools. Your tools are very important. The first tool is the media, radio, newspapers, televisions, to drive public debate. I spoke about Itodo today. Amazing work in the media. You know, there are a whole lot of people across the radio, the media space, that can grant you a voice. In fact, the media space has been democratized. All what you need is your mobile phone and mobile data. You know, something just happened right now, or you learn the hard way. Do your thing, so long as you're accountable, so long as you trust yourself, so long as you know that what you're doing is important, you can amplify your voice. So there's the radio. Research is also a very important tool. I've seen people mess up very interesting advocacy points or policy influencing points because they do not have data. It is also it's only a fool that argues with data. It's only a fool that argues with fact. If I want to go on an advocacy now, remember I told you I will give you what research is saying, what the research is saying. 100 children are going to die tomorrow if you do not take this decision now. It's backed by data. I'm not just saying it because I like calling numbers. It must be backed by data. So you cannot be an effective policy influencer without understanding how to utilize data. And the only way for you to get data is through research. You must be able to do that research. If you can't do it, you must have people who are able to do the research that you're able to bounce off. Mobilizing and campaigning is a very, very important toolkit. There are people who we call mobilizers. You don't only need mobilizers to run for office. You need mobilizers to support your advocacy work, support your policy influencing work. It's very, very important. You need a proper information dissemination channel. Some people are creative people. You put it in infographics, it's beautiful. For example, this presentation I am presenting today, this is not my typical presentation. If Wumi is on this call, she'll bear me witness. But I try to, ask myself, how can I make it better? And I got on a tool, and ran my stuff, and it gave me, and I think I like this. I like how simple it is. It's not too worded, very easy to understand, right? Information dissemination is important. What you came up with a policy brief through your research, how do you disseminate it? You can disseminate it through radio, through social media. You can disseminate it. Litigation and lobbying is also an important tool. Litigation is taking, like I said, taking the governor to court. It was few years ago, I mean, less than 3 years ago, 2 years ago, someone took the VIO to court. And guess what? He won. That the VIO, doesn't have any business on state roads. He won. Sometimes there are a whole lot of things that happens around us. I would just think it's Nigeria. Nothing would happen. But I mean, he's a lawyer, so he had the time and the bandwidth to do. I've seen people take. I mean, I was just reading yesterday. Someone took, was it Aero Contractors or Arik, to court for delaying him, and he won 11 million in the case. That will be paid to him. Litigation is a tool for advocacy. Litigation is a tool for policy influencing. Lobbying is also, some of you think lobbying is wrong. There are ethics around lobbying. There must be ethics around. The problem with Nigeria is there are no limits to anything. People can just do anything, that they want. But in advanced democracies, lobbying is an effective tool, because it places political pressure, within the corridors of power. Protests and rallies, this everybody knows this, everybody comes out, Take It Back movement is out there on the streets, I mean, rallies, I'm not talking about the kind of rallies we do in Nigeria for political offices. NSAS, for example, petroleum subsidy removal 2012, NSAS 2020, these are, protests and rallies, that have happened. Now, one of the tools that we do not speak about enough is monitoring and evaluation. You need to track the progress of your policy influencing. Like I said, policy influencing is scientific. And anything that is scientific, you need to be able to ensure proof is very important. You need to ensure that the systems are very important. You need to ensure that you're able to monitor and evaluate, what is being spoken about. You know, I mean, I have, a template of what your, policy influencing should be like, what you should do at every point. Before you go, you need to establish a clear agenda. You need to be very sharp on what you're speaking about. You need to have your data. And this is a process. You may not have everything at the same time. The more you do it, the better you become at it. It becomes a second skin, right? I'm not saying that you have to have it 100%, but I'm saying that if you start practicing little by little, you continually grow, right? You have to establish clear goals. It's very important before you get there. Establish clear goals. You must be prepared. Like I said, you don't need to be an expert. When you get into the room, you must listen. Sometimes as advocates, we talk too much. We don't listen. We don't listen. And remember that you cannot get the root cause of the problem if you are not listening, if you are not observant. Most times people talk so much that you cannot even hear yourself. So as an advocate, you have to listen well. You have to develop the skill of listening, and you have to be comfortable listening to opposing ideas. I know that it will get a point where you begin to shout, I no go agree, we no go agree, but listen first. You have to listen, right? Recognize their past accomplishments, in similar endeavors to build rapport. One of the things I do, honestly, is to, before I meet anybody, I try to check them, check the antecedents. For example, I was meeting someone who was going to become the head of service. She was a director, but we had got information that she was going to become the head of service, and we got into her office, and I said to her that, I mean, she's done a great work. I've never heard. I mean, I don't know what she's done, but I just felt because she was going to be made, the head of service, it means that she's been in the civil service for a long time. I mean, I wasn't lying. I wasn't complimenting. I was just saying that, we hear that you are the next pick for the head of service, and she felt elated, and she opened up, and it was a fresh conversation, right? Because we're able to break the ice, we're able to build a rapport, you know, clearly lay out the problem and the intended consequence of your advocacy. I talked about that. If you do not fix this primary health care center, 50 children are going to die. If you do not do this, this is what is going to happen. and present your policy brief persuasively. One of the things I always go with a fact check. I have everything, I design it, it's beautiful, I'm able to give to you. So whilst I'm speaking, you're looking at it, I'm able to convince you with that. Then after the handshake, you need to follow up. Follow up becomes critical. You need to remember that the ultimate goal is to build a long-term relationship, not just secure a single transaction. So there are times when, even though we go head to head and we speak to ourselves in a certain kind of ways, we're not doing that so that we become enemies. No, the purpose is not to become an enemy. The purpose is for you to understand this is what I'm passionate about. And anytime you see me, this is what I stand for. There are times when you have to strike those barriers. I've had people that, I get into a meeting and we're all shouting at ourselves, but when we're leaving, everybody's shaking hands. And I can pick up my phone and reach out to them at any time and say, there's a problem, this is what I think. And in fact, what happens is when they find themselves in a difficult situation, because they know that you are intelligent enough, you understand the problem, they would reach out to you first to say, this is what is happening, what do you think about this? And this is how I've been able to build my work over the years. So there's a process for you to be able to go through, a strategy formulation. I mean, policy advocacy, or policy influencing chain. The first one is issue selection. Pinpoint the precise issue. Don't take too many things. It confuses you. You would get confused and you confuse other people. Just be precise. Be on point. Be on point. Don't waste your time dilly-dallying about everything. Number two, gather and analyze information. We've spoken about this. Don't go to the Ministry of Health when what you're talking about is the Ministry of Education. Stand before the ministry. you know I mean, very funny story. Someone was doing an advocacy around education, and he was on TV and he was calling out the Commissioner of Health. And I was like, this is rubbish. What are you doing? It's an education conversation. What concerns us with Ministry of Health? All right, the commissioner of health. Develop your aims and objectives is very important. You must have your aims and objectives clearly stated. Then the step four is identify your targets. Remember, I told you that the corridors of power is very important. You must identify who your primary target is, your secondary targets. Who your secondary targets are. You know, and so um what this does for us, if you follow this entire slide, you'd realize that what we've been building, is a perfect board, you know. And on this board, we started with the pieces, advocacy toolkit, that provides specific levels to generate the pressure, the right kind of pressure. The foundation, is the principles, credibility, legitimacy, accountability, service and power, the bodies, mastering the corridors of power. You have to do that. I cannot overemphasize this. You have to do that. You cannot get into you can't get into the office of, whoever you want to, and you start constituting a nuisance there. You have to strike a balance. And then, understanding the winning condition, is also very important. I hope that with these few points of mine, I've been able to convince all of you on the call and not confuse you at any point, in this presentation. Thank you so much. I will take questions now. Or I hand over to Chiamaka. What's the flow? Let me know the flow so that we can probably take some questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for showing us what makes you an expert in your field, and I really enjoyed your lecture. We're going to ask questions, so please, if you have any questions, please do raise your hands so that I can unmute you and you ask your questions to our facilitator for today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Tunde,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for this. So my first question is this: you spoke about policies, guidances, and laws. So my question is, where do they overlap, and are they the same? And the reason I say this is because I remember during COVID-19, I produced guidelines on childcare support bubbles, or informal kind of like childcare for during COVID-19. I think it was I produced policy in relation to how, households, you need to provide, how friends or family can come together to produce childcare support during COVID-19. However, albeit it was like kind of guidance, it was also official guidance, but it would also be known that it kind of looked at policies. And then if you breach the guidelines or that policy, that means you're breaching a law. So if you breach the law, then you can be punished. That's the first question. So do they overlap? And are guidelines, policies, and are they all different? And then also I'd like to say, I know we have I don't know if we have any official governmental advocacy organizations. I know we have, sorry, Chatham House. You also have maybe the CLO in Nigeria. So do you think there'll ever come a time when we'll have official governmental advocacy organizations? And also, where do pressure groups come in relation to advocacy? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Brilliant questions. You'd help me with. I'll start from the first, and if I skip please just remind me. The first is the dichotomy between policies and laws, right? Policies are pronouncements and blueprints of government. Say, my name is Bisaya. I'm the governor of XYZ state. And in these states, nobody should walk after 10 o'clock. It's a policy. And the reason why it's a policy is because it has not gone through the act of parliament. Now, if I go further to say, I am now sending a bill to the State House of Assembly, to stop people from moving from 10 o'clock every night. What happens at that point, it becomes, if it goes through the parliamentary process and the members of parliament, it goes through the first reading, the second reading, probably goes to the committee stage where everybody comes, puts in, and everybody puts in their voice, and it's passed, in parliament. It comes back to me as the governor and I assent my signature. It becomes a law. Right? Now, if it's not a law, it is not justiciable. You cannot take people to court based off on a policy, or you cannot take the government to court based on its policies. It's not justiciable. The law would not sit on it because it doesn't carry the weight of the law. It has not been passed into law. Right? And you also know that when even a state passes a law, the federal law, can pretend over the state's laws, because of, the federal system that we find ourselves. Now, the local government actually makes what is called bylaws. So the councillors are parliamentarians on the level of the local government. They can make their own laws. And that's where it gets really beautiful. But unfortunately, the space in Nigeria is a bit messed up, right? And it will allude to your second question also. Now, the COVID-19 policies. Now, there are some policies that has the backing of a law. For example, there are some policies, for example, with the lockdown, you know, I know that there are components of the law, that backed up the lockdown to say that the government, I think there's a law like that. If there's a lawyer, help me, that backs up the fact that government can restrict movement because of the need for probably greater safety or something and all of those stuff. So a government can, make its policies based on an existing law. But if that policy is not relying on an existing law, it's then not justiciable. But in the Nigerian constitution, so for example, the right to education is a fundamental human right. It's under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So someone would say to me, if I'm an out of school child, or if they're out of school children, I should be able to take the government to court because of the out of school children. Unfortunately, in the constitution, what you call your rights, there is a clause that makes it unjusticiable, unjusticiable within the Nigerian constitution. Especially, I mean, I know about the right to education because I know that you cannot take the Nigerian government to court because there are children who do not go to school, because there's a clause that makes it possible, that you cannot, take the government to court because of that. And now, the more people, and that's why I love what the work Electoral College is doing. And that's why I always come back. Because I believe so much that the more people are able to understand, the more people are able to know, the more people are able to jump on this kind of conversations, the more knowledge they get. And if you probably decide to run for office, or you probably, know someone who is running for office, you can have these kind of conversations with the person. For example, there is a law that can impeach the president. We've had presidents that have committed impeachable offenses and nothing happens. So sometimes the problem is not the lack of the law. The problem sometimes is the fact that the laws that are supposed to hold people to account has been made very weak. And hence the problem. But we feel that it's going to change. We're hopeful that it's going to change. You understand? Now, for example, in the Universal Basic Education Act, if a parent does not take his child to school, there's an amount you have to pay. It's there. But nobody's going to work on that. I think you're supposed to pay 100, was it 100 naira or 1,000 naira? Actually, in fact, part of the advocacy we had was to take out that clause of payment and create a jail time, a jail time for it, for parents who are not able to take their children to school. So it's very important, that we understand that a policy, most often than not, doesn't have the backing of the law. When it goes through parliament, it's no longer a policy. It becomes a law because it's gone through parliament and there's been the presidential, assent to it. I gave an example when I started. I said, for example, we cannot take Tinubu or the federal government to court because he said that if he doesn't give us electricity, we shouldn't vote for him again. It's not justiciable. It was not backed up by law. It's going to be different if, he submitted that as a bill to parliament. You understand? Then we can be able to hold them to account. If not, we'll just hold them to account based on the words that they say. But it's not justiciable. On your second question, there are a whole lot of advocacy organizations. Electoral College is indeed an advocacy association, right? Is Wumi on this call? I mean, I think, Kule Lawal will probably, is Wumi on the call, please?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, Electoral College is an advocacy organization, I guess.
Yes, it is.
Absolutely. So, sir, you are on one of the advocacy organizations. I mean, the CLOs and the other guys, they are not there again. So we have a whole lot of not-for-profit organizations who budget is there, connected development is there, an organization I worked for, where we led Follow the Money doing massive work advocacy and all of those stuff. There are a whole lot of organizations in Nigeria. The problem, is the fact that, and if I want to start talking about this, we'll probably not close today because the problem with the North, and I've written severally about it. I have an article about it. I'll probably find it before I leave and share the link. I wrote about the over bloated ego of the civil society. And for me, it was born out of the reality. Having worked in the space for over a decade, that there are a whole lot of things that we are supposed to be doing that we didn't do, and there are a whole lot of things, unfortunately, that the government, is holding us on our necks for. So I wrote that article. I'll probably dig up that article and share the link. Or I think it's called Rethinking the Overbloated Ego. What was I thinking about when I was writing this? Overbloated ego of the civil society. In fact, there's some people that calls it evil society. So yeah, they're there, but just like every every situation in the country has its own challenges. I've put the link. You can read through my thoughts in that regard. Speaking about the pressure groups, I mean the NLC. I was saying on this, there was a time when the NLC coughed, the trade unions, the government shook, but we don't have that happening again. And the reason is because the government has cleverly weakened the rank and file of this, pressure groups. And those pressure groups are just quite, I mean, I probably call them rubbish now, And one of the signs of a declining democracy is when the pressure groups are not able to speak. When that happens, you begin to see that democracy is declining, and it's declining on a daily basis. In fact, from 2015, remember that under Goodluck Jonathan, when the Bring Back Our Girls campaign started, it was massive. Everybody was out. Those of you who lived in Abuja at the time, you would go to the Unity Fountain and you'd see a whole lot of people there talking about bring back our girls, bring back our girls. But in 2015, when the government that profited from that massive campaign and that massive uprising, came into power, one of the first things they did was to begin to tear gas people who sat, at the Unity Fountain. And if you go there now, they barricaded the whole place. It was really ridiculous. The first EndSARS protest that we had happened, the first EndSARS protest happened in 2019, at the Unity Fountain. We were less than 50 people there. So when it happened again in 2020 and everybody came out, I was like, wow, it's interesting how these things grow, right? Now, so when governments come in and they begin to weaken the power of the civil society and pressure groups and the unions, it's a decline. It shows a decline, in the civil society space. And from 2015, we've experienced massive decline till now, and it still continues quite unfortunately. I hope I've been able to answer your question, Tunde. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. So I think the policy I designed was in the UK here, because I'm a civil servant here, and it went through secondary legislation. So yeah, thank you for that. But also I think when I was talking about I won't take too much of your time, advocacy groups, I don't know of any governmental organizations, which is basically a government organization but serves as an advocacy.
I'm
you
sorry,
have think
Tunde,
tanks.
can you wrap up quickly, because we
Okay,
don't
all
have
right.
time and we
Yeah,
have
so
so many questions.
yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah. So
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Unfortunately, the distrust within the Nigerian space has made it extremely difficult. For example, if the government has that, I would not be a part of it because I know it's rubbish. Honestly, this is just me being serious. The distrust, the UK is a high trust society. Nigeria is a very low trust society. It's a very low trust society. I mean, it's so low trust that if you see me tomorrow shake hands with the president, one of the first things that comes to your mind is, no, Busayo is a sellout. That is how low trust Nigeria is. But if you see me shake hands with, not Stammer, this guy, what's his name now, the current
Bonham,
guy.
Andy
Yeah,
Bonham.
the current prime minister, Bonham, Andy. If you see me shake hand with Andy, you would send me a message and says you say, Busayo, you are doing well. Because Nigeria is a low trust society, and that's the problem. Yeah. Let's take
Thank you.
Elvis. Yeah, thank you so much, Tunde. Elvis, let's take your question. I think I have just about 5 minutes to go. I don't want us to hit the 7 o'clock mark.
Elvis, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you.
Yes, good evening, sir. My question is, I have been a passionate advocate from a local community where people are not educated. I launched a campaign on children educational right against child labor across 30 communities on the Mambila Plateau in Taraba State. I create awareness among 20 to 25 communities on some other zoonotic diseases outbreak, especially fibrosis, since I was contacted it when I visited my village. But going out on this advocacy, the stakeholders we have, the traditional rulers we have, when meeting them, like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm doing around the community, the first thing they label it is like an attack. When you go and advocate about the deficit or dilapidated school structures, not having resource water, basic amenities in a community, the next thing you hear is maybe you see DSS inviting you, the former Speaker of the House, though I'm from the village of the former Speaker of the House, the oldest member in Taraba State House of Assembly, where you will see him, you just call DSS. DSS will invite you to Njalingo and say, hey, we heard you visited this community.
Sorry,
They said you advocated on
do you
this,
have
this,
a
this.
question or a comment? Who is speaking?
Yes.
Do you have a comment? Please, okay. Please
Yes,
go straight
I'm on
to
call.
the question, please.
You're
There's no time.
Yeah, I understand you, Elvis.
Okay.
What's the question?
So the question I wanted to ask is, how do we go about these local communities where a lot of people still suffer with this same narrative? People that are a bit educated, they use them as talk. When you post online, they attack you. When you go back to the communities, they attack you on advocacy campaigns.
Absolutely. It's a familiar terrain. I know what you're talking about. And one of the systems we created when I was at Follow the Money was that we have what we call community entry and community penetration strategy. Unfortunately, we don't have so much time to speak about that. It's an entire strategy work. But I'll summarize it. One of the first things we do when we get into any community is to first of all introduce ourselves to the community governance structures. And by the community governance structures, I mean the king or the head of the community or the chief of the community. And in that would request for the women leader, would request for the youth leader, would request for all of them, right, to come, just to have a conversation. What we do is to follow the culture and the tradition. If I'm going to the South, for example, I must take cola, and I must take some, some drink, because of that festive welcome ceremony that happens at that level. I didn't know about a whole lot of these cultures, but one of the things that is important is you must understand the culture you're dealing with. There's no how I come to the South with cola and I'm able to wedge the cola that they would not at least listen to me. That's the first thing. So community penetration and community entry is very, very important. The second thing I'll do is I would not go alone because, like I said, Nigeria is a low trust society. And so what happens is if you want to be able to drive a change or if you want to create solutions, one of the things you must do, as a matter of importance or urgency is the fact that you must be able to have a network. Don't go alone, go with sorry guys, my son is I'm eating into his time, so he's come to check up on me. I'm on a class. Just give me some time. I'm on a class. Yeah. So sorry about that. Now, it's very important. It's very important that you go as a team. It's very, very important that you go as a team, so that it's easy for them to harass. I'm coming. I'm coming. It's easy for them to harass one person, but it's difficult for them to harass a team, as a team. So it's important, there's strength. And in the session, I said emphatically that you shouldn't travel alone, you shouldn't go alone. And the next thing that we do is when we arrange those kind of meetings, we introduce ourselves, we tell them the issues, we tell them the challenges, we show them with evidence. If you followed this class, you'd realize that I say that you have to have it clearly stated, clearly written. This is the problem. This is the reason why we're advocating for this. We need your support. The next thing you have to do is to locate the closest police station to you. When you locate the closest police station, it's easy for you to introduce yourself, to say, my name is XYZ. I'm coming to this community to be able to do this. The police knows you, the community knows you. You would realize that if there's a problem, one of the people that would defend you is the community or the police themselves, will be able to defend you. So this is very, very important. Now, identifying that person, the person you described, the former speaker, identifying that person shows to you that that person is your definite opponent. You need to begin to look for other partners, and that's why it's a strategic work you have to do. You've started something. I don't want you to stop, but I want you to become more deliberate and more strategic. And that's why I'm going to share these slides with everyone. If you need any help, hit me up via my website. I'm probably available to support that process you're going through. So these are the strategies we've been able to use to manage some of these things. Victoria, let's have you very quickly.
Good evening, sir. Sorry, I did a thing and I was asked that I should go and use the power of social media. So I thought of it that is it that they want somebody to become VDM or how? So I was a little bit discouraged and I don't know how if you can put me through why, because the local government, the department of the ministry, they were just putting at the end of the day, they were suggesting the power of the social media. So I want a little clarification.
Yeah, and I think when that happens, and it's quite unfortunate when that happens, what it simply means is that even the people are tired of the system. I mean, that's one of the things it shows. They're tired of the system. They know that nothing is going to change, so they have said, "My sister, go to social media." Now, social media has democratized information, has democratized access to information a whole lot. So I mean, you don't have to be VDM, right? VDM understood at some point that he can get a voice and he can use social media. And there are a whole lot of people also, using social media. Honestly, if you can't get on radio, if you can't get on TV, you have your social media. You can use your social media. You can use any tool, within the ambits of the law. It's very, very important. Now, I used to assume that the people in government or the people or the civil servants who work in government, were ignorant people until I started engaging with them and I realized that sometimes some of them are handicapped. They don't know what to do. And sincerely, I hear where the advice is coming from. Go to social media because the politicians do not want to look bad. So when you call them out on social media or so I know there was this guy in Edo State. There's another person in Ogun State who is a pastor who just takes his phone and videos the bad road and posts it on social media. I know he's been able, they've arrested him so many times also, but I know he's been able to drive some engagement around the conversation, and the governor has been able to step in to fix some of the roads. And I know that Nigeria is quite difficult because it presents a whole lot of difficulties that if everybody needs to go on the social media, we're not going to survive. Now, one thing that is also very important is the fact that an advocacy, can go for many years. An advocacy can go for 10, 20, 30 years. Ogoni cleanup, for example, has gone for over 30 years. Kensariwa died on it. A whole lot of people have died on it. There's been protests to Shell, there's been protests. It has not even changed. The petroleum industry bill went through so many years. There are so many advocacies that could take years, depending on the severity of the issue. And that's why, for me, an important way, if you go back to what I said, when you are speaking on behalf of the community, it's the least, is the lowest part of your advocacy. You can invest, and it's the same thing to Elvis. Elvis, you can go back to your community and invest this knowledge that you have in young people in the community. Let the young people who live in the community every day be the ones to talk about it. It provides you security, provides you safety. When you are tired, when you're not able to go, they would go along because the community sometimes do not even understand what these challenges are. Until the day I met someone in the community and I said, "Do you know that this frequent, stooling of blood from your children is because of the water that you drink?" They didn't understand. They thought that the children were experiencing demonic attacks, and they were seeing blood in their stool until we're able to educate them to say, this is the reason why this thing is happening. And the reason why this is happening is because there's no potable water. And these are the kind of conversations. So instead of you sometimes you don't have to be VDM. I mean, VDM's strategy, I mean, he's doing great. I don't have a problem, but his strategy still falls to me at a certain level. We need to go a step higher because if I am just the one talking about the problem, almost nothing is going to happen. Just like I said to Elvis, they would arrest you, they would intimidate you. But if it's a group of people, would they arrest everybody from the community? I'm not sure that is going to happen because that in that community, everybody knows everybody. So imagine I'm living in a community and I talk about an issue and you bring the DSS to arrest me from my father's house, everybody around me would come out. Do you understand? It's easy for them to do that to you because they probably do not see you as a part of their community. But if you invest time in engaging, in building the capacity of the community, making them understand that the reason why this is happening is because of this, the reason why they are sick, the reason why their children are sick, the reason why their mom died, the reason why they are, and back it up with data. The moment you begin to conscientize them, their eyes opens and they say, wow, we didn't know that this was the cause of this. And the moment they know, you would see them beginning to take action consciously or subconsciously. I hope I've been able to answer all your questions. All right, thank you so much. Thank you guys for listening in today. It's always a pleasure to come back. Thanks, Eze, for the 1999 Constitution declared state of emergency. Yeah, if there's an occurrence, yeah, this is what I said. Yeah, absolutely. Where there's a law that backs up a policy can ride on a law, but a policy that does not have any law, behind it is not justiciable. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Priska. Thank you, Wumi. God bless. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, everyone. Please don't forget to go on our YouTube to check out this class in case you missed it. Share it with your friends. And I hope that all that our wonderful facilitator has taught us today, we're going to implement it in our workplaces, in our community, in our villages, wherever we are. Good night, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.